Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Ashern Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. Some of the strangest experiences in my life actually began before I was old enough to remember them. Everything I'm about to describe comes partly from my own memories and partly from stories my mother told me over the years. Whether you believe in the paranormal or not, it's one of those stories that has always stayed with me because of how many odd details seem to connect together. According to my mother, when I was around 2 years old, she became fascinated with a Ouija board. At the time, she treated it as little more than a curiosity. She wasn't trying to summon spirits or anything dramatic like that. Like a lot of people, she simply found the idea interesting and spent time experimenting with it. What happened next was something she never forgot. She claimed that whenever she used the board, she frequently communicated with the same spirit. The spirit identified itself as an 8-year-old boy named Henry. At first, the conversations seemed ordinary enough. Then they became disturbing. According to my mother, Henry would repeatedly say that he hated me, not disliked me. Hated me. He allegedly told her that I had stolen his place in the world. He insisted that my mother was supposed to be his mother. The messages became increasingly hostile whenever I was mentioned. At the time, my mother didn't know what to make of it. It sounded bizarre and unsettling, but she eventually stopped using the board and tried to move on with her life. There was, however, one detail that always lingered in the back of her mind. About a year after I was born, she suffered a miscarriage. It was something that deeply affected her, even though she rarely spoke about it. Years passed. Life moved on. The Ouija board became nothing more than a strange memory, or so she thought. Roughly 14 years later, my mother decided to visit a psychic. Now, before this happened, she wasn't someone who strongly believed in psychics. In fact, she was skeptical. The visit was more out of curiosity than conviction. What happened during that session is what eventually convinced her that something unusual might have been going on. Without being told much about our family, the psychic reportedly began describing personal details about my mother's life. Then she said something that immediately caught my mother's attention. According to the psychic, my mother was supposed to have had 3 children. My mother was stunned. She hadn't mentioned the miscarriage. She hadn't discussed her family history, yet the statement directly connected to something only she knew. The psychic then asked if she had an older teenage son. At the time, that was me. When my mother confirmed it, the psychic supposedly became serious. She told my mother that there was a vengeful spirit of a child attached to me. According to her, this presence had been following me for years. Hearing that immediately brought the old Ouija board story back into my mother's mind. The boy named Henry, the child who supposedly believed I had taken his place, the child who insisted that my mother should have been his mother. Whether the connection was real or coincidence, it shook her. What made the story even stranger was that I'd experienced unusual things for most of my life. As long as I can remember, I've occasionally heard things that nobody else seemed to hear. Voices whispering when no one was around. Footsteps moving through empty rooms. Scratching sounds coming from places where there was nothing that could have caused them. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of dark shapes out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that seemed to move when they shouldn't have. Whenever I turned to look directly at them, there would be nothing there. I never really knew what to make of any of it. Some experiences were easy to dismiss. Others were harder to explain. But one particular detail from my childhood has always stood out. When I was very young, I used to talk about someone I called the Black Man. To be clear, I wasn't describing a person's race. I was describing a figure. A man dressed entirely in dark clothing. Someone I claimed to see regularly. Like many parents, mine initially assumed I had an imaginary friend. Young children say strange things all the time, but they became concerned when I started describing him in greater detail. I would talk about his appearance, his face, the way he dressed, and where he stood. At some point, my parents realized something unsettling. The person I was describing matched someone they actually knew, or rather someone who had once lived there. Before we moved into the house, our landlord's husband had died while performing repairs on the property. I had never met him. I had never seen a photograph of him. Nobody had ever described him to me. Yet, according to my parents, the details I provided closely matched what he had looked like when he was alive. That realization deeply unsettled them. For me, he had simply been someone I talked to. For them, it became something much harder to explain. As I grew older, the experiences gradually became less frequent. The voices, shadows, and strange feelings never completely disappeared, but they became easier to ignore. Life went on. Still, every now and then, I'll think back to the stories my mother told me. The Ouija board, the spirit named Henry, the miscarriage, the psychic who claimed a child was following me, the mysterious figure from my childhood who seemed to resemble a man I'd never met. Maybe there are logical explanations for all of it. Maybe memory, coincidence, and imagination filled in the gaps over the years. Or maybe some stories don't fit neatly into ordinary explanations. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that these events have stayed with me my entire life. And even now, whenever I hear unexplained footsteps in an empty house, or catch a shadow moving where it shouldn't be, I can't help but wonder whether some part of that strange story is still following me. Without question, this was the scariest night I experienced during an entire year of traveling by bicycle. A few years ago, I spent 12 months riding through multiple countries on a long-distance bicycle tour. It was the kind of trip most people only dream about. I crossed vast stretches of wilderness, slept under countless stars, and camped in places that felt completely removed from civilization. Over the course of that year, I found myself pitching a tent almost anywhere I could. Sometimes it was along remote dirt roads, sometimes deep in the backcountry. I camped near the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, high in the mountains of Peru, and in countless other isolated places where the only sounds at night came from the natural world around me. After so many months on the road, sleeping alone outdoors had become second nature. I'd learned how to find safe campsites. I'd gotten used to strange noises in the darkness. I'd encountered wildlife before. Very little still managed to scare me. By the time this story happened, my journey was almost over. I had made it back to the United States and was only a couple of days away from finishing the trip entirely. I was in Arizona, my home state. For the first time in months, I felt completely comfortable. The unfamiliar countries, languages, and landscapes were behind me. Home was right around the corner. That evening, I found a quiet spot in the Arizona desert and set up camp. The weather was perfect. I pitched my tent, secured my gear, and hung my food high in a cactus to keep animals from getting into it during the night. After that, I crawled into my sleeping bag and settled in for what I expected would be an uneventful night's sleep. At first, everything was peaceful. The desert was quiet. The stars were incredible. I could feel the satisfaction of knowing my long journey was almost complete. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, I heard something moving nearby. It sounded small, a light scurrying noise through the dirt and brush. My first thought was that it was some kind of desert animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a ringtail, maybe something even smaller. Whatever it was, it seemed harmless. I listened as it approached the side of my tent. The footsteps would come closer, then stop. A few seconds later, they would come closer again, then stop. It seemed curious, almost cautious. After a while, I sat up and tried to peek outside to see what it was. The moment I moved, the sound vanished. The animal ran away. I lay back down. A few minutes later, it returned. Again, I heard it approaching. Closer, stop, closer, stop. Every time I attempted to look, it disappeared. At that point, I wasn't frightened. Mostly, I was curious. After spending a year camping outdoors, seeing wildlife had become part of the experience. I wanted to know what was investigating my campsite. Eventually, I came up with a plan. I opened the tent flap and sat quietly inside. I turned off my headlamp, but kept it ready in my hand. My finger rested on the power button. I aimed it toward the area where I kept hearing the movement. Then I waited. The desert around me was silent. Several minutes passed. Then I heard it again. Soft footsteps, approaching. Closer, closer, closer. This time it came all the way up to the tent. I pressed the button. The beam of my headlamp shot into the darkness. 2 eyes reflected back at me. They glowed brightly in the light. The animal stood completely still, just staring. I stared back. Honestly, I still wasn't worried. It looked like some small creature investigating my camp. Nothing unusual. Then, while we were locked in this strange staring contest, I decided to sweep the beam of my headlamp to the left. Immediately, I saw another pair of eyes. I froze. What? I shifted the light slightly farther. Another pair. Now my attention sharpened. I swung the beam to the right. 2 more eyes. My stomach dropped. I moved the light farther, another pair, and another. Suddenly, the entire situation changed. What I had assumed was a single curious animal was not alone, not even close. I leaned farther out of the tent and swept the beam behind me. More eyes. 2 glowing reflections staring back from the darkness. Then another pair, and another. Everywhere I pointed the light, eyes stared back. The realization hit me all at once. I wasn't being visited by one animal. I was surrounded, completely surrounded. To this day, I still remember the surge of adrenaline that followed. My heart started pounding. The desert around me suddenly felt enormous and hostile. Every direction contained another set of eyes reflecting in the darkness. I had no idea what they were. Coyotes, wild dogs, something else entirely. All I knew was that there were a lot of them, far more than I was comfortable with. The beam of my headlamp revealed only eyes, no clear bodies, no easy way to identify what I was looking at, just pair after pair after pair surrounding my campsite. The desert had gone from peaceful to terrifying in a matter of seconds. I remember thinking, what kind of animal surrounds a tent in the middle of the Arizona desert? The answer never came. I wasn't about to go investigate. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my travel guitar. For an entire year, that little guitar had been my companion on the road. I'd played it in campsites across multiple countries. That night, it became my emergency defense system. I started strumming, loudly, as loudly as I possibly could. The sound echoed through the darkness. Every time I thought things were getting quiet, I'd play again. I wasn't trying to make music. I was trying to convince whatever was out there that I wasn't worth approaching. So I stayed awake, strumming, listening, watching, waiting for sunrise. Hour after hour, the darkness seemed endless. Every sound made me tense. Every glance beyond the edge of my campsite made me wonder whether those eyes were still out there watching. Eventually, the eastern horizon began to lighten. The first hints of dawn appeared. As the sun slowly rose over the desert, the fear that had gripped me throughout the night finally began to fade. Morning light has a way of making even the most terrifying situations seem less threatening. but I never did figure out exactly what had surrounded my tent that night. After spending a year camping alone in some of the most remote places imaginable, the scariest night of the entire trip didn't happen in the Amazon rainforest. It didn't happen in the Andes Mountains. It didn't happen in some distant foreign country. It happened 2 days from home in the Arizona desert, while I sat in a tent surrounded by dozens of glowing eyes and desperately played guitar until sunrise. One of the most frightening experiences of my life happened when I was about 5 or 6 years old. Even now, decades later, I can still remember pieces of it with unsettling clarity. Other parts, however, feel fragmented and broken, as though my mind intentionally buried them somewhere deep where I couldn't easily reach them again. At the time, I had come down with a cold. It was a weekend, and my mom was working part-time at a local hospital. My dad and older brother were home with me while she was at work. I don't remember feeling particularly sick. At least, not seriously sick. I certainly don't remember having a fever. Looking back now, though, I've convinced myself that I must have had one. It's the only explanation that has ever made any sense to me. Sometime during the day, my dad decided I needed some rest and sent me to bed. I wasn't happy about it. Like most kids, I hated naps. I remember lying there awake, staring into the darkness behind my closed eyelids, trying to force myself to fall asleep. The house was quiet. Outside, it was summer. My bedroom windows were open to let in some air. For a while, nothing happened. Then I felt a light breeze brush across my face. At first, it didn't seem unusual. The windows were open after all. A breeze was completely normal, but for some reason, it made me open my eyes. The moment I did, everything changed. Floating above my bed were figures, several of them. I can still see them in my mind. They weren't full bodies, just heads, shoulders, and necks suspended in the air. They wore dark hoods that framed their faces, and their faces were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The skin looked red and burned, raw and fleshy. Their expressions stretched into dark, unnatural smiles. For a few seconds, they simply hovered there, watching me, silent, motionless. I froze. Every instinct told me something was terribly wrong. Then they started laughing. The sound was horrible. Not loud at first, just a low, cruel laughter. As they laughed, they began moving, slowly circling above me, drifting around my bed, watching me the entire time. The room suddenly felt impossibly small. I remember panic exploding through me. I clamped my hands over my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut. I started crying. But the laughter didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. The harder I tried to block it out, the more overwhelming it became. I was absolutely terrified. Finally, I screamed for my dad. The moment I called out, he came running into the room. I don't remember how quickly he arrived. Only that suddenly he was there, holding me, trying to calm me down, telling me it had only been a dream, a nightmare, that I was safe. But there was one problem. I knew I hadn't been asleep. I hadn't drifted off. I hadn't been dreaming. At least that's what it felt like. I had been awake. Completely awake. And yet the figures were gone. The room looked normal again. The breeze still drifted through the open window. Everything seemed exactly as it should have been, except I was hysterical. What happened afterward becomes blurry, very blurry. That's one of the strangest parts. My memories from that period are fragmented in a way that's unusual for me. It's like someone tore pages out of a book and left only scattered pieces behind. I know time passed. I know adults were worried, but much of it is missing. There is only one other memory that survives clearly. I remember being in my dad's car, not sitting normally, hiding, curled up in the trench of the back seat. My knees were pressed tightly against my chest. My hands were clamped over my ears. I was shaking, terrified. My mother was there too. She had somehow gotten into the back seat with me. I remember her sitting on either side of me, trying to comfort me and shield me, and I remember screaming over and over. I was telling them the figures had come back, that they wouldn't leave me alone, that they wanted me dead. Those words still disturb me when I think about them, not because they're particularly shocking now, but because they came from a terrified child who genuinely believed what he was saying. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't telling a story. I was convinced those things were real. After that memory, everything fades away again. The next thing I know is years later. I know we were heading to the hospital. I know adults must have believed something serious was happening. And as an adult, I assume the most likely explanation is that I was suffering from a severe fever. Perhaps the cold had developed into something worse. Perhaps I was hallucinating. Perhaps the entire experience was the result of a child's brain reacting to illness. Logically, that's what makes the most sense. It's the explanation I've accepted for most of my life. Yet there is one lingering detail that never went away. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes experience an intense and irrational feeling of panic whenever everything becomes too quiet. It's difficult to describe. It's not ordinary silence. It's that strange moment when the world feels so quiet, it almost hurts. When there seems to be an absence of sound rather than simply a lack of noise. Most people probably don't even notice it, but I do. And every time it happens, I feel a surge of fear that I can't fully explain. Because that exact sensation, the unbearable silence, was always present whenever those hooded figures appeared. I remember it as clearly as I remember their faces. The silence, the breeze, the laughter, the red skin, the dark smiles. Whether they were nothing more than fever-induced hallucinations or something my childhood imagination created during an illness, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that more than 20 years later, the memory still has the power to make my heart race. And whenever the world suddenly becomes too quiet, some small part of me is still that frightened child lying in bed, afraid to open his eyes. One of the creepiest experiences I ever had wasn't supernatural at all. In fact, that's probably what made it so unsettling. It happened during my college years while I was living in the dorms. Like most college students, my roommates and I were loud, immature, and generally unconcerned with bothering anyone around us. Our room was usually full of people hanging out, listening to music, playing games, and generally making far more noise than we probably should have. One afternoon, while we were being particularly obnoxious, a guy none of us recognized wandered into our room. Literally, wandered in. At first, we were confused. Nobody had invited him. He wasn't one of our friends. He just appeared in the doorway and casually walked inside as though he belonged there. We learned that he lived on the floor above us. The guy immediately struck everyone as a little unusual, not threatening exactly, just socially awkward in a way that made interactions feel uncomfortable. Still, he seemed harmless enough. College dorms are full of eccentric people. You meet all kinds, so nobody thought much of it. We chatted with him for a while, and eventually he left. That should have been the end of it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. After that first encounter, he started showing up more often, a lot more often. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He'd stop by and join conversations or hang around our room. Then he started actively seeking us out, especially me and a few of my friends. At the time, we had recently discovered the joys of smoking weed and spending entire evenings doing absolutely nothing productive. For a short while, he'd occasionally hang around during those sessions. The problem was that he became even stranger when he was high. Conversations with him were awkward. His behavior became unpredictable. What might have been mild social awkwardness, while sober, became deeply uncomfortable when he was stoned. Eventually, I decided I simply didn't want to spend time with him anymore. The problem was that he was incredibly persistent. He didn't take hints. He didn't recognize social cues. And he seemed to have no concept of when someone wanted to be left alone. Being a typical college student, I chose the least mature solution possible. Instead of confronting him directly, my friends and I started avoiding him. Whenever we saw him coming, we'd leave. If he knocked on the door, we'd pretend not to be there. If we spotted him across campus, we'd go another direction. To be fair, we weren't exactly subtle about it. And eventually, he figured it out. That was when things became uncomfortable. For some reason, he didn't seem to blame the group. He blamed me. As far as he was concerned, I was the reason everyone had distanced themselves from him. From that point forward, it became obvious he didn't like me at all. There was never a direct confrontation, no threats, nothing concrete. Just an unmistakable feeling that he hated my guts. The situation simmered like that for a while, until one afternoon something happened that genuinely scared me. I walked into my dorm room and found him sitting there, talking with my roommate and a couple of other friends. I immediately felt uneasy. The guy had this strange smile on his face. Not a happy smile, not a friendly smile, just something about it felt off. As I walked in, I realized he was telling everyone about his life. Specifically, he was talking about how difficult his childhood had been. He described being isolated, rejected, ostracized by people throughout his life. The conversation itself wasn't particularly unusual. People open up sometimes, especially in college. But then, completely out of nowhere, he said something that instantly changed the mood in the room. Something I still remember word for word, years later. Yeah, I'm a sadist, so if I ever killed anyone, I'd torture them first. The room went silent. For a second, nobody knew how to react. I remember looking around and making eye contact with everyone else. Every single person had the exact same expression, a look that basically said, "What the hell?" Nobody laughed. Nobody thought it was funny. Nobody treated it like a joke. It wasn't even the words themselves as much as the way he said them, calmly, matter-of-factly, as though he were discussing the weather. There was no smile afterward, no indication that he was trying to shock people. Just a simple statement delivered with complete sincerity. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Everyone became visibly uncomfortable. The conversation died shortly afterward, and once he finally left, all anyone could talk about was how disturbing the whole thing had been. We decided to report our concerns to the resident advisor. We explained his behavior, the strange comments, the growing obsession with our friend group, the fact that he seemed particularly angry with me. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. The RA listened, but didn't appear especially concerned. As far as they were concerned, no actual threat had been made. No rules had been broken. Case closed. That response didn't exactly help me sleep at night, especially because of one additional problem. It was the middle of a brutally hot stretch of weather. Our dorm had terrible ventilation. The only way to get any airflow into the room was by leaving the door cracked open at night. My roommates insisted on doing exactly that. I hated it. Every night I'd lie awake staring at the open doorway. Every creak in the hallway made me tense. Every shadow moving past the opening caught my attention. I kept imagining that strange smile. I kept hearing that sentence replaying in my head. If I ever killed anyone, I'd torture them first. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, it wasn't exactly comforting. For several nights, sleep was hard to come by. Weeks passed, then months. The situation never escalated. He never threatened me. He never confronted me. He simply remained a strange, unsettling presence around the dorm. And then one day, he was gone. Just gone. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody knew whether he transferred schools, moved away, dropped out, or something else entirely. People asked around. Nobody seemed to have an answer. It was as though he had simply disappeared. To this day, I have no idea what became of him. Maybe he was just an awkward, lonely guy with poor social skills. and an unfortunate tendency to say disturbing things. Maybe there was nothing more to it than that. I hope that's the truth, but even now, years later, whenever I think back on my time in the dorms, he is one of the first people who comes to mind. Not because of anything he did, but because of how strongly he made everyone around him feel that something wasn't quite right. And sometimes the people who scare you the most aren't the ones who actually do something dangerous. They're the ones who leave you wondering whether they might. This is one of those memories that I don't think about very often. In fact, I can go years without remembering it. Then I'll come across a discussion about creepy experiences, strange encounters, or close calls, and suddenly the entire memory comes rushing back as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The older I get, the more unsettling it becomes. At the time, though, I don't think I fully understood how frightening the situation actually was. I was somewhere between 14 and 17 years old when it happened. I can't remember my exact age, only that I was still living at home with my parents. Our house sat in a very small town, and when I say small, I mean the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else. People recognized your family name before they recognized you. News traveled fast. Strangers stood out immediately. My room was at the very end of the hallway and faced the street. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I always felt uneasy in that room after dark. Ever since we'd moved into that house, I experienced frequent nightmares and occasional night terrors. Even when I wasn't having bad dreams, there was often a vague feeling of being watched or simply not wanting to be alone. My cat became my solution to that problem. She spent most of her time either outdoors or curled up somewhere in my room. She had developed a routine that felt almost magical. Whenever she wanted back inside, she'd come to my window and scratch at the screen until I let her in. More often than not, she'd appear exactly when I needed her. If I was lying in bed feeling anxious or creeped out by some unexplained noise, there would suddenly be that familiar scratching at the window. Then she'd jump inside, curl up nearby, and everything would feel normal again. One particular night, though, she hadn't shown up. It was a weekend, probably around 10 or 11 o'clock at night. My parents were still awake, so it wasn't especially late. For some reason, however, I became impatient, waiting for my cat to return. Looking back, I don't know why I was so determined to find her. Maybe I was already feeling uneasy. Maybe I simply missed having her around. Whatever the reason, I decided to go outside and call for her. I stepped out into the front yard and started doing exactly what every cat owner eventually does. "Here, kitty, kitty." I walked around for a minute or two, scanning the darkness and calling her name. The neighborhood was quiet. Nothing seemed unusual. No strange sounds, no movement, no indication that anything was wrong. After a few minutes, I gave up. Cats come back when they want to come back. I figured she'd eventually show up at my window like she always did. At that point, I turned around to head back inside, and that's when I saw him, standing directly behind me. To this day, I don't know how he got there. I had been facing away from the house, looking around the yard and street. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard a voice. I hadn't heard breathing. Nothing. Yet somehow there was suddenly a man standing less than 2 feet away from me, close enough to touch. Close enough that if I had taken a single step backward, I might have walked directly into him. I remember freezing, not dramatically, not screaming, just stopping completely. For a second, we simply stared at each other. The man was old. That's the detail I remember most clearly. An older man standing in my yard in the middle of the night. No greeting. No explanation. No apology for startling me. Nothing. Just staring. I wish I could tell you exactly what he looked like, but honestly, the shock of the moment swallowed most of the details. What I remember is the overwhelming realization that a stranger had somehow approached me without making a sound, and he had gotten close. very close. My brain couldn't process it. Every possible reaction seemed unavailable. I didn't scream. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't run. Instead, I turned around and walked back toward the house. At least that's how I remember it. In reality, I was probably moving much faster than I realized. I just wanted to get inside, get behind a locked door, get away from him. Once I got into the house, I was shaken badly, but strangely, I didn't immediately tell my parents. Looking back, I have no idea why. Fear does strange things to people. Part of me wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. Part of me worried I wouldn't be taken seriously. And part of me simply didn't know how to explain what I'd just experienced. So I kept it to myself. For a little while anyway. Eventually, I told my dad. The moment I explained what had happened, he reacted exactly as you'd expect. He shot out of his chair, marched outside, and began searching the area. He checked the yard, the street, the nearby houses, anywhere a stranger might have gone. But the man was gone, completely gone. No sign of him anywhere. At the time, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he had wandered onto our property by mistake. For years, that explanation was enough. But the older I get, the less convincing it feels. Because when I really think about the details, none of it makes sense. We lived in an extremely small town. Everyone knew everyone, especially my family. My mother and grandmother were well known in the community. People recognized us. Yet I had never seen that man before, not once. And after that night, I never saw him again. Not in town, not at local events, not anywhere. Over 20 years have passed and I still have no idea who he was. There were no unfamiliar cars parked near our house. No visitors expected that late at night. And even if someone had been looking for directions or intending to knock on our door, why would they be standing deep inside our yard instead of near the sidewalk or driveway? Why would they be silently standing directly behind a teenage girl? Why get that close without saying anything? That's the part that still bothers me. Not the mystery of who he was, the mystery of what he was doing. Because when I turned around, he wasn't approaching. He wasn't walking toward the house. He wasn't calling out for help. He was already there, standing within arm's reach, watching, and sometimes, late at night, I still think about how easily things could have gone differently. If I had waited another few seconds before turning around. If I'd walked farther from the house. If he had decided to do something instead of simply standing there. I'll never know who he was. And honestly, after all these years, I don't think I want to. Some mysteries are unsettling enough without ever learning the answer. All I know is that one quiet night, while searching for my cat in a tiny town where everyone knew everyone, I turned around and found a stranger standing less than 2 feet behind me. And that memory still puts a knot in my stomach every time I think about it. This is one of the few experiences in my life that I still can't explain, no matter how many times I've tried. Even now, years later, thinking about it gives me chills. At the time, my mom had recently opened a wholesale bakery. The bakery operated out of a separate living space attached to the home of a family friend. It had originally been the in-laws' quarters of the house, and after some renovations, it became the perfect place for a small business. The owner of the house was a longtime family friend. He had spent the previous 20 years caring for his elderly mother, who had lived there with him until her death. She had passed away not long before the bakery opened. From what everyone could tell, he was having an extremely difficult time coping with the loss. His mother had been a huge part of his life for decades, and after she died, he struggled to let go. He kept most of her belongings exactly where they had always been. Rooms remained untouched. Personal items stayed where she had left them. It was obvious that he wasn't ready to move forward. At the time, I knew very little about the details of the situation. I knew his mother had died. I knew he missed her. That was about it. One day I was working alone in the bakery. It was a normal day. I was focused on work, going through my routine and thinking about nothing unusual. Then something happened that completely caught me off guard. Without warning, I was overwhelmed by a vivid image of an elderly woman. Not a memory, not a passing thought. An image. It was so strong and so sudden that it felt as though someone had interrupted my own thoughts and replaced them with hers. The woman was angry, not mildly annoyed, furious. She was yelling at me. At first I couldn't understand what was happening. I had never seen her before. At least, I didn't think I had. Yet there she was in my mind, as clearly as if she were standing directly in front of me. She kept demanding to know where someone was, over and over again. "Where is he?" The question repeated endlessly. She wouldn't stop asking. What made it even stranger was the language. She wasn't speaking entirely in English. The words seemed to switch back and forth between English, Serbian, and Russian. At the time, I knew she had originally been born in Serbia, but that fact wasn't something I was actively thinking about. The experience felt completely disconnected from anything I consciously knew. Everywhere I went in the bakery, the image followed me. If I moved to another room, she was there. If I focused on work, she interrupted my thoughts. The feeling was relentless. I wasn't seeing a transparent ghost standing in front of me. It was more like an overwhelming mental presence that refused to leave. And she kept asking the same thing. Where was he? Where was her son? Then the messages became more specific. She insisted that he needed to move on. She wanted him to let go. She repeatedly mentioned dresses. At the time, this made absolutely no sense to me. I had no idea why dresses would matter, but she seemed fixated on them. Again and again, she urged that the dresses needed to go, that he needed to stop holding on to them. She also kept mentioning her other children. There was frustration in her voice whenever they came up. Yet at the same time, she wanted her son to forgive them. The message repeated itself in different ways. He needed to forgive his siblings. He needed to move on. He needed to let go. The experience lasted far longer than I was comfortable with. I kept trying to ignore it, trying to focus on work, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the woman remained stubbornly present in my thoughts. Finally, I learned that her son wasn't at the property that day. The moment I realized he wasn't there, something changed. The feeling disappeared. The image vanished. The voice stopped. Just like that. The silence afterward felt almost shocking. For the first time all day, my own thoughts were completely my own again. I remember feeling unsettled and deeply confused. Part of me wanted to dismiss the entire experience. Another part couldn't stop thinking about how vivid it had felt. Eventually, I decided to tell our family friend about it. I was hesitant because I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Still, I described everything I could remember. The woman's appearance, the way she spoke, the languages, the things she kept repeating, the dresses, the message about moving on. The request that he forgive his siblings. As I talked, his expression changed. At first, he seemed skeptical, then increasingly uncomfortable, then genuinely shocked. When I finished describing the woman, he quietly pulled out a photograph. My stomach dropped. The woman in the picture was the same woman I had been seeing all day. Not just generally similar, the same woman. What made it even stranger was what she was wearing. The outfit matched exactly every detail I had described. The clothing, the appearance, everything. I had never seen the photograph before. I had never met her while she was alive. And yet, there she was, looking exactly as she had appeared in my mind. Then came the details that disturbed me even more. The dresses. As it turned out, he had been keeping large amounts of his mother's clothing. He couldn't bring himself to get rid of them. I hadn't known that. No one had told me. The subject had never come up. Then there were the issues involving his siblings. Apparently, there had been serious family conflicts after their mother's death. Arguments, disputes, resentment. Again, I knew nothing about any of it. Yet those were the exact topics that had dominated the strange experience. By the end of the conversation, neither of us knew what to say. There was no obvious explanation, no logical reason for me to know those details, no reason for me to recognize a woman I had never met, and certainly no reason for me to describe a photograph I had never seen. The whole thing scared the life out of me. For weeks afterward, I replayed the experience in my head, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe I had overheard conversations without realizing it. Maybe I had seen a photo somewhere and forgotten about it. Maybe my brain had connected random pieces of information in a strange way. Those explanations helped a little, but they never fully explained everything. More than a year later, I was still thinking about it. And even now, after all this time, I honestly don't know what happened that day. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was intuition, maybe it was something I'll never understand. All I know is that while working alone in a bakery, I spent an entire day being mentally followed by an angry, elderly woman I had never met, who desperately wanted her son to let go of the past. And when I finally described her, someone pulled out a photograph and showed me the exact face that had been haunting my thoughts all day. This happened shortly after my aunt passed away. At the time, I was grieving pretty hard. Losing her hit me harder than I expected, and I remember feeling emotionally drained for days afterward. I wasn't sleeping well, and when I finally decided to try getting some rest, all I really wanted was a few hours where I didn't have to think about funerals, loss, or any of the emotions that come with saying goodbye to someone you love. I've never been the type of person who believes in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. Even after what happened that night, I still try to find logical explanations for it, but I can't deny that it scared me. That night, I was lying in bed facing the wall. My back was toward the bedroom door, and my dog was asleep on the floor nearby. My dog had always been incredibly calm. He wasn't one of those dogs that barked at every little noise or growled at shadows. In fact, it was rare to hear him growl at all. That's why what happened next immediately got my attention. Out of nowhere, he stood up. Then he started growling. Not a playful growl, not the kind dogs make when they're excited. This was low, steady, and serious, the kind of growl that makes you instinctively pay attention. At first, I figured he had heard something outside, maybe a neighbor walking by or an animal moving around the yard, but the growling continued. I sat up in bed and looked around the room. My dog wasn't looking toward the window, he wasn't looking toward the hallway. He was staring directly at my bedroom door, completely focused. His body was tense, his eyes never moved. Naturally, I looked at the door too. That's when I noticed something. Standing near the doorway was what appeared to be a dark shape, not a clearly defined person, more like a black silhouette or shadow. For a moment, I just stared at it. I had been crying earlier, and my eyes were still irritated and blurry. I immediately assumed that was the explanation. Maybe my vision was playing tricks on me. Maybe the darkness in the room was creating strange shapes. Maybe I was simply exhausted. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and the shape seemed less distinct. Trying to convince myself it was nothing, I lay back down. Eventually, my dog settled down too. The room became quiet again. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. A little while later, it happened again. My dog suddenly got up. The same growl, low, deep, focused. I opened my eyes immediately. This time, before I even sat up, I heard something. A voice. Soft, clear, close enough that it sounded like it was inside the room. The voice said, "Goodbye, JR." The moment I heard it, every ounce of sleepiness disappeared. I jumped out of bed. My heart was pounding. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. The room was empty. No one was at the door. No one was in the hallway. No one was anywhere. I searched every corner of the room. Nothing. Now there was one other detail that made the entire experience even stranger. Earlier, I had some balloons in my room from a recent event. They were helium balloons tied together and sitting in one spot. I hadn't thought much about them. They were just decorations. As I stood there scanning the room, trying to figure out where the voice had come from, I noticed movement. One of the balloons had separated from the group. At first, I didn't think much of it. Balloons move. Air currents exist. Nothing unusual there. Then I looked closer. The balloon wasn't just drifting. It had somehow detached itself from the others. The problem was that all of the balloons had been tied together. There was no reason for one to suddenly break free. No one had touched them. No one else was home. And from what I could see, the knot hadn't simply come loose. Yet somehow one balloon was now floating by itself. What happened next left me completely confused. The balloon began moving around the room, not simply bobbing in place, not slowly drifting toward a wall. It appeared to be circling around the room, passing from one side to the other, floating in a path that seemed deliberate enough to catch my attention. I stood there watching it, trying desperately to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was airflow from a vent. Maybe I had disturbed the air when I jumped out of bed. Maybe the movement only seemed unusual because I was already frightened. But after hearing the voice and seeing my dog's reaction, everything suddenly felt far more unsettling than it probably should have. I stayed awake for a long time after that. My dog never completely relaxed for the rest of the night either. Every small sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed suspicious. And no matter how many explanations I came up with, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had happened. Looking back, grief may have played a role. I was emotionally exhausted. I was sleeping poorly. My mind was focused on the recent loss of my aunt. Those things can affect how people perceive events. I understand that. But even with that in mind, there are parts of that night that I still struggle to explain. The growling, the voice, the shadow near the door, the balloon separating itself from the others and drifting around the room. Maybe there is a perfectly rational explanation for every single detail. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that shortly after my aunt passed away, on a night when I was alone with my dog and trying to get some sleep, I heard a voice say goodbye to me, and it's an experience I've never forgotten. This happened about 3.5 years ago, and even now it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was during summer vacation and one of those nights where sleep just wasn't happening. A friend and I were chatting online sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. We were both bored out of our minds and looking for something to do. The weather had been incredibly hot all day, and even late at night the air was still warm. After talking for a while, I jokingly suggested that we go swimming. There was a lake hidden in a forest not too far from my house, and during the summer the water was usually warm enough to swim in, even at night. To my surprise, my friend immediately agreed. The idea sounded exciting. Stupid maybe, but exciting. So we made plans to meet up. The lake was about a 20-minute walk from my house through a heavily wooded area. Under normal circumstances, the trail wasn't difficult to follow, but this wasn't a normal situation. It was the middle of the night. The forest was pitch black. The moon provided just enough light to keep us from walking directly into trees, but not much more than that. Still, we were young, restless, and convinced that nothing bad could happen. We made our way through the woods and eventually arrived at the lake. The place was completely deserted. No cars, no other people. No sounds except the occasional rustle of leaves and the gentle movement of water against the shore. We changed into our swim trunks and got ready to go in. Before entering the water, we agreed on something important. We planned to swim a good distance away from shore, and since it was so dark, we needed a way to find our way back. To make sure we could always see where we'd left our clothes, we placed a flashlight on the ground and aimed the beam directly toward the lake. That way, no matter how far out we swam, we'd have a visible point of reference. Satisfied with our plan, we ran into the water. At first, everything felt great. The lake was warm, the night air was comfortable. For a while, it felt like we'd stumbled upon the perfect late-night adventure. We kept swimming farther and farther from shore. Eventually, we were roughly 50 meters out. That's when things started to feel different. I've always had a fear of deep water. Even during the daytime, I don't particularly enjoy being unable to see what's beneath me. At night, that fear becomes much worse. There we were, floating in the middle of a dark lake, unable to see the bottom, surrounded by black water and darkness in every direction. The shoreline had become a distant silhouette. The forest looked like a solid wall of shadows. Every splash sounded louder than it should have. Every movement beneath the surface felt suspicious. Trying not to let my imagination get the better of me, I turned around and looked back toward the flashlight. My friend did the same. The beam was still shining brightly from the shore. Then it disappeared. For a split second, the light went out completely. Then it came back. Then it disappeared again, then returned. Off, on, off, on. It wasn't flickering. It looked exactly like something was passing in front of it, like someone was walking between the flashlight and the lake. The moment I saw it, every muscle in my body tensed. I stared at the shoreline. My friend stared too. Then he turned toward me. "Did you see that?" The fear in his voice told me I wasn't imagining things. "Yeah," I replied. We both continued staring toward shore. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just floated there in the dark water, watching, waiting, trying to figure out what we'd seen. The problem was obvious. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. We were deep in the woods. There shouldn't have been anybody else there. The possibility that someone was standing on the shore near our clothes was far more frightening than either of us wanted to admit. For the next 5 minutes, we remained where we were. The flashlight stayed steady. Nothing moved. Nothing happened. No figures appeared. No sounds came from the forest. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe a branch had moved. Maybe an insect had flown in front of the beam. Maybe we'd misinterpreted what we'd seen. At least, that's what we wanted to believe. Finally, we decided to swim back. The entire way to shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every stroke seemed slower than usual. Every second felt longer. When we finally reached shallow water, relief washed over me. We quickly climbed out and hurried over to where we'd left our clothes. Neither of us wasted any time. We dried off as fast as possible and started getting dressed. The sooner we left, the better. Then, just as we were preparing to head home, I bent down to pick up the flashlight. That's when I saw it, a shoe, lying on the ground right beside the flashlight. I froze. For a moment, I simply stared at it. It definitely wasn't mine. It definitely wasn't my friend's. And I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there when we arrived. We had both been standing in that exact spot earlier while setting up the flashlight. The area had been empty. Now there was a single shoe sitting next to it. Neither of us touched it. Neither of us tried to investigate. At that point, we didn't care where it had come from or who it belonged to. The only thing we cared about was leaving, immediately. We grabbed our things and got out of there as fast as we could. The walk back through the forest felt much longer than 20 minutes. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made us look over our shoulders. Neither of us spoke much during the walk home. We were too busy replaying the events in our heads. To this day, neither of us has any explanation for what happened. Maybe someone had been there the entire time. Maybe someone arrived while we were swimming. Maybe whoever walked in front of the flashlight accidentally left the shoe behind. Or maybe there's some explanation we've never considered. Whatever the truth is, neither of us ever returned to that lake at night. And even now, years later, we still get chills whenever the story comes up. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't knowing what happened. It's never finding out. This happened when I was 23 years old, and even now I struggle to explain it. I've only told a handful of people about it over the years. Most of the time I keep it to myself because I know how unbelievable it sounds, but it remains one of the strangest and most terrifying experiences of my life. At the time, I was walking through a stretch of woods that connected two parks in my hometown. It was a route I had taken before, and while it wasn't exactly isolated, it wasn't heavily traveled either. It was a summer evening, and daylight was starting to fade. I remember checking the sky and realizing I needed to pick up the pace if I wanted to make it out of the woods before it got completely dark. The forest was alive with sound. Crickets chirped from every direction. Insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Birds called occasionally from the trees overhead. The constant hum of summer wildlife filled the air so completely that I barely noticed it, at least not at first. I continued walking along the dirt path, focused on getting through the woods before nightfall. Then something changed. At first, I couldn't figure out what felt different. There was no obvious sound, no movement, no warning, just a growing sense that something wasn't right. As I walked, I became unusually aware of my own footsteps. The crunch of dirt beneath my shoes sounded strangely loud. I could hear my breathing clearly, every inhale, every exhale. It was only then that I realized why. Everything else had gone silent. The crickets were gone, the insects were gone, the birds were gone. The entire forest had fallen completely quiet. Not quieter, silent. The kind of silence that immediately makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I slowed slightly and looked around. Nothing seemed unusual. The trees stood motionless. The path stretched ahead exactly as it always had. Yet the silence felt wrong, deeply wrong. A feeling of unease settled over me. I told myself I was being paranoid and kept walking. About a minute later, I heard a laugh. It was faint and muffled, just enough to catch my attention. I stopped and listened. Nothing. The silence returned. I shrugged it off. The woods connected two parks after all. Maybe someone was nearby. Maybe the sound had carried farther than I realized. Trying not to overthink it, I started walking again. Then I heard it a second time. Another laugh. Still distant. Still strange. This time, it sounded closer. I stopped again. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. At that point, I was definitely uncomfortable. My instincts were telling me something wasn't right. I started walking faster. Then everything happened at once. A loud laugh exploded through the woods. Not distant, not muffled, right there, clear as day. To this day, the only way I can describe it is as a twisted, demented version of Woody Woodpecker's laugh. It was high-pitched, manic, almost playful. But there was something deeply unsettling about it, something that instantly triggered pure fear. The moment I heard it, I spun around. And that's when I saw something impossible. A large metal garbage can came flying through the air. Not rolling, not falling, flying. It appeared above the trees. The garbage can and its lid were both airborne, soaring over a tree that had to be at least 20 feet tall. For a split second, I just stared. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Then the can came crashing down near the path beside me with an enormous metallic bang. The sound echoed through the woods. I completely lost it. I screamed. I don't mind admitting that. Every survival instinct in my body took over, and I started running. Fast. I didn't care what had caused it. I didn't care whether there was a logical explanation. I just wanted out of those woods. As I sprinted down the trail, something else caught my attention. Ahead of me, somewhere beyond the next bend, I could hear movement. It sounded like something large running away. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavy movement through the brush. The strange part was that it seemed to be staying just ahead of me. Whatever was making the noise wasn't approaching, it was retreating, as though it knew I was there, as though it had already seen me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I rounded a bend in the path, then came another sound, a massive splash. Not the sound of a rock hitting water, not the sound of a small animal, a huge splash. The kind of splash something very large makes when it enters water at speed. I froze for a moment and looked toward the pond. The path ran alongside part of it, giving me a clear view. The water was still disturbed. Ripples spread across the surface. I could actually see the tail end of the splash settling down, as though whatever had entered the pond had done so only seconds earlier. The timing was perfect. I had heard something running. I had heard the splash, and now I was looking directly at the disturbed water. But there was nothing there. No animal, no person, nothing swimming, nothing surfacing, just expanding ripples. The pond itself made the situation even stranger. It wasn't a clean recreational pond where people swam or fished. It was gross, muddy, covered in algae and muck, the kind of water most people wouldn't willingly step into. That fact has always bothered me because it eliminates the explanation I desperately wanted at the time. Kids fooling around, teenagers hiding in the woods, some elaborate prank. None of it really fit. I had to continue around a large section of the pond because the path curved along its edge. The entire time I kept glancing toward the water, waiting, expecting something to emerge, a person, an animal, anything. Nothing ever did. The surface gradually became still again. The forest remained silent, and I kept moving as fast as I could until I finally reached the other park and the safety of open space. Even after leaving the woods, I couldn't calm down. My hands were shaking, my heart wouldn't slow down. Every detail kept replaying in my head. The unnatural silence, the laughter, the garbage can flying through the air, the sound of something running, the enormous splash. For years, I searched for explanations. Maybe someone had thrown the garbage can. Maybe there were people in the woods I couldn't see. Maybe fear distorted my perception of events. Maybe. But none of those explanations have ever completely satisfied me. What troubles me most is how everything happened together. One event might be explainable. Two events maybe. But all of them? The sequence has never made sense. And despite the passage of time, I still dream about that evening. Sometimes I'm back on the path, listening as the forest falls silent. Sometimes I hear that laugh again. Sometimes I see the garbage can sailing over the trees. Every time I wake up with the same feeling I had that day. A feeling that, for a few minutes in those woods, I encountered something I still don't understand. And honestly, after all these years, I'm not sure I want to. This happened a few summers ago when I was around 15 years old, and to this day, it's still one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had. Back then, my friends and I spent nearly every day together. School was out for the summer, we had very little supervision, and like a lot of teenagers, we thought we were invincible. Most days were spent hanging out, causing harmless trouble, and doing whatever we could to keep ourselves entertained. On this particular day, a few of my closest girlfriends and I were hanging out at one of their apartments. We had been smoking and drinking for most of the day. Looking back now, it probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world, but at 15 years old, none of us were exactly known for making responsible decisions. By late evening, I was starting to feel sick and exhausted. The combination of being tired, dehydrated, and spending the entire day partying had finally caught up with me. I decided I was done for the night. At that point, I was practically living at my friend's apartment anyway. I'd been spending so much time there that it felt like a second home. Without thinking twice, I headed into her bedroom and collapsed onto one of the couches. I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, I was woken up by my friends. They were planning to sneak out. My friend lived on the first floor and her bedroom window opened directly outside. There wasn't a screen or any sort of barrier on it, so we'd gotten into the habit of using it almost like a second door. People came and went through that window all the time. Half asleep, I listened as they told me they were heading out and asked me to make sure the window was closed behind them. I remember agreeing. After they climbed out, I got up, closed the window, and went back to sleep. At least, that's what I thought happened. Apparently, a few minutes later, one of the girls came back because she'd forgotten something. She opened the window from the outside, grabbed whatever she needed, and then left again. What nobody realized was that she never closed it afterward. By then, I was already asleep again. The couch I was sleeping on sat directly across the room from the window. In fact, my head was only about 2 or 3 feet away from it. If someone stood at that window, they would have been almost right beside me. I had no idea that detail would become important later. At some point during the night, I woke up slightly. Not fully awake, just aware enough to notice a rustling sound coming from outside. At first, I wasn't concerned. I assumed my friends were coming back. The noise seemed consistent with someone climbing through the window. I rolled over and tried to ignore it. Then the sound changed. Instead of coming from outside, it sounded like it was coming from inside the room, right beside me, near my head. That immediately felt wrong. If my friends had come back, they would have been talking, laughing, or at least making more noise. This sound was quiet, careful, deliberate. Still half asleep, I lifted my head and muttered my friend's name. I expected to see one of the girls standing near the window. Instead, I found myself staring directly into the eyes of a stranger. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The man's face was only inches away from mine. He wore a dark beanie pulled low over his forehead. A scarf covered his mouth and nose, leaving only his eyes visible. His arms were already inside the room. He had apparently been reaching around on the floor near the couch, and his body was halfway through the open window. We stared at each other. I think I surprised him just as much as he surprised me. He clearly hadn't expected someone to be sleeping on the couch. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a second or two, we remained frozen. Then reality hit me. I screamed, not a startled yelp. A full, terrified scream, the kind that comes from pure panic. The man's eyes widened. He immediately pulled himself backward toward the window. For a split second, I thought he was going to flee. Then he hesitated. Instead of leaving, he reached toward his belt. That moment terrified me more than anything else. I couldn't see clearly without my glasses. My eyesight is terrible and I wasn't wearing them. All I could make out was the motion of his hand moving toward his waist. My mind instantly jumped to the worst possible conclusion. A gun. I genuinely believed he was pulling out a gun. I screamed even louder. I tried to throw myself off the couch. I wanted to run, hide, get away, but panic had completely taken over. My body felt disconnected from my brain. My arms and legs wouldn't cooperate. Everything felt slow and clumsy. The stranger raised something toward me. I braced for a gunshot. Instead, a blast hit me directly in the face. The burning started instantly. It felt like someone had thrown fire into my eyes. I gasped and stumbled backward. Tears poured down my face. My skin felt like it was on fire. Only then did I realize it wasn't a gun at all. It was mace. The man had sprayed me directly in the face. By the time I could see again, he was gone. The window was empty. The stranger had disappeared into the darkness. I was alone, completely alone, and utterly terrified. The burning was unbearable. My eyes felt like they were melting. Every blink made the pain worse. I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't stop shaking. I grabbed my phone and called my friends. The moment they answered, I broke down. I was sobbing so hard I could barely speak. I begged them to come back immediately. My friend's mother was out of town, which meant I was alone in the apartment with no idea what to do. For what felt like forever, I sat there crying and trying to breathe through the pain. The mace had gotten into my eyes, onto my skin, and into my nose. I genuinely thought I might be going blind. When my friends finally got back, they found me in hysterics. Someone remembered hearing that milk could help with pepper spray and mace, so they soaked a washcloth and laid it across my face. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it helped enough that I could finally start calming down. Eventually, we called the police. Officers arrived and looked around the apartment. They examined the window. They took photographs of my face. They checked the area around the couch. They asked questions. At first, I thought they were taking the situation seriously. Then their attitude changed. The more they talked, the more it became obvious that they didn't believe me. Eventually, they concluded that there hadn't been a man at the window at all. According to them, I'd simply had a vivid, delusional dream, a nightmare brought on by sleeping, maybe by drinking, maybe by being tired, maybe by imagination. The fact that my face had been sprayed with mace somehow wasn't enough to convince them. My friends believed me, every single one of them, but the police treated the entire thing like a waste of time. Eventually, they left. No suspect, no investigation, no answers, just the suggestion that it had all happened in my head. The weeks afterward were awful. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those dark eyes staring at me from inches away. The beanie, the scarf, the realization that a stranger had been halfway through the window while I slept. I started having anxiety attacks. Windows terrified me. Even now, years later, I struggle to sleep near them. It doesn't matter whether they're open or closed. It doesn't matter whether I'm on the first floor or the 10th. Every time I wake up near a window, part of me expects to see that same pair of eyes staring back at me from the darkness. What bothers me most isn't what happened. It's that whoever that man was, he got away. No one ever identified him. No one ever caught him. And somewhere out there is a stranger who climbed halfway through a teenager's bedroom window in the middle of the night, sprayed her in the face with mace, and vanished into the darkness without a trace. That thought still keeps me awake sometimes. This probably isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it's definitely one of the creepiest. The story goes back to my high school years, when a group of friends and I discovered an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Like most teenagers, we were immediately fascinated by it. The place had clearly been deserted for a long time. The windows were dirty, weeds had overtaken parts of the property, and the entire house had that eerie feeling that comes from years of neglect. Naturally, we couldn't stay away. Over the next few weeks, we visited the house several times just to explore and mess around. It became one of those places we'd go when we were bored and looking for something interesting to do. The layout was unusual. It was built into a hill, almost like a walkout basement design. Most of the basement was underground, but one side of it opened to the outside through a separate entrance. The upper floors were easy enough to access, but the basement was another story. The exterior basement door had been sealed shut. A large wooden board had been nailed across it horizontally, making it impossible to open. The wood looked old and weathered. The nails were rusted. Everything about it suggested the entrance had been blocked off for a very long time. Months at the very least, possibly years. That fact only made us more curious. Eventually, curiosity got the better of us. One afternoon, armed with a crowbar and far more confidence than common sense, we decided we were finally going to see what was down there. We pried against the board until the old wood cracked and splintered. After a lot of effort, we managed to pull it loose and gain access to the basement. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. A wave of stale air rolled out from the darkness inside. The place looked exactly how you'd expect an abandoned basement to look. Dust covered everything. Old boxes were scattered around. Broken furniture sat rotting in corners. Cobwebs stretched across beams overhead. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional creak of the house settling around us. At first, nothing seemed unusual. We slowly made our way deeper into the basement, using flashlights to illuminate the darkness. Then one of us noticed something. Near the center of the room was a small area that looked completely different from everything around it. While the rest of the basement was covered in dust and debris, this particular spot had been cleared. The floor looked clean, almost intentionally cleaned. Naturally, we walked over to investigate. In the middle of the cleared area sat a single sheet of paper. Resting on top of it was a red rose. For a moment, nobody said anything. The sight was strange enough that we simply stared. The rose looked almost perfectly preserved. Then we realized why. It wasn't real. It was a plastic rose. Still, that wasn't the part that bothered us. What bothered us was that neither the rose nor the paper had any dust on them, not even a thin layer. The basement itself looked as though it hadn't been disturbed in ages, yet these two objects appeared fresh, recently placed, as if someone had set them there only days earlier, maybe even hours. One of us carefully picked up the paper. Printed in the center was a large pentagram. Around the edges were symbols none of us recognized. At the time, we were just teenagers with active imaginations, so naturally our minds immediately jumped to all kinds of dark conclusions. Was it some sort of ritual? A prank? Evidence that someone had been secretly using the basement? None of us knew. What we did know was that we suddenly wanted to leave. The atmosphere of the basement changed the moment we found those objects. Every creak sounded louder, every shadow seemed darker, the place felt wrong. Within a few minutes, we were back outside. We tried laughing it off afterward, convincing ourselves it was probably nothing. Some local kids had probably snuck in before us. Maybe somebody interested in the occult had left it there. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Eventually, life moved on. The abandoned house became just another weird memory. Then something happened that brought the entire experience back. About a week later, I was cleaning out my truck. Like most teenagers, I treated my vehicle like a rolling storage unit. There were fast food wrappers, empty drink bottles, random tools, and all kinds of junk scattered throughout it. As I cleaned the back seat, I noticed a folded piece of paper wedged between some items. At first, I didn't think much of it. I picked it up and unfolded it. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. It was the paper from the basement, the same paper, the same pentagram, the same strange symbols around the edges. I immediately froze. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it. I knew exactly where it had come from. I also knew I hadn't taken it. At least, I didn't remember taking it. As far as I knew, none of us had touched it beyond briefly examining it. The discovery bothered me enough that I contacted all of my friends who had been there. One by one, I asked them if they had taken the paper and left it in my truck as a joke. Every single one denied it. They all claimed they hadn't touched it. They all insisted they knew nothing about how it ended up there. To this day, I still think one of them probably took it and never admitted it. That explanation makes the most sense. But what made the situation so unsettling wasn't necessarily the paper itself. It was the timing, the fact that we'd found it in a basement that appeared sealed for years, the fact that it had been sitting in a perfectly clean space while everything around it gathered dust, and the fact that somehow it ended up folded neatly in the back seat of my truck afterward. Looking back now, I'm sure there's probably a perfectly ordinary explanation for all of it. Teenagers have a way of making situations seem far creepier than they really are. Still, every now and then, I think about that basement. I think about the untouched rows, the strange symbols, the cleared section of floor, and finding that paper sitting in my truck a week later. Even after all these years, it remains one of those experiences that leaves you wondering whether you really know the full story. And honestly, part of me isn't sure I wants to. This is a story that was told to me by my mother, so I have no personal memory of it. I was only a few months old when it supposedly happened. Whether you believe in curses, black magic, or any of that sort of thing is entirely up to you. I honestly don't know what to make of it myself. All I know is that my mother has told this story the same way for as long as I can remember, and she has never doubted what she experienced. The story begins shortly after I was born. My parents' relationship was already falling apart, and only a few months into my life, my father left my mother for another woman. According to my mom, the breakup was devastating. She suddenly found herself caring for an infant alone, while trying to cope with the collapse of her relationship. To make matters worse, she had heard unsettling things about the woman my father had left her for. People in the community claimed the woman practiced voodoo, black magic, or various forms of spiritual rituals. Whether those rumors were true or not, my mother couldn't say. At the time, she didn't pay much attention to them. That changed during one of the final encounters between them. According to my mother, when my father was leaving, the woman was sitting in the car with him. As they prepared to drive away, she allegedly looked directly at my mother and told her that she had placed a curse on me. It was such a bizarre thing to say that my mother didn't know how to respond. She was upset, exhausted, and trying to focus on taking care of a newborn. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as a cruel attempt to frighten her, but then strange things started happening. Not long afterward, my sleeping habits changed dramatically. Night after night, my mother would check on me and find something that terrified her. I would be asleep, completely asleep, but my eyes would be wide open. Not partially open the way some babies sleep, wide open, staring, fixed on something she couldn't see. My mother described it as one of the most unsettling things she'd ever witnessed. She said I looked as though I were staring directly at someone standing beside my crib, or watching something in the darkness that wasn't visible to anyone else. Every night it was the same. She would put me to bed. Hours later, she would return to check on me. There I would be, sleeping soundly with my eyes fully open, motionless, silent, just staring. The sight frightened her so much that she barely slept herself. Instead, she spent night after night sitting nearby, watching me and making sure I was okay. The strangest part was that every morning I seemed completely normal. I wasn't sick, I wasn't crying, I wasn't acting differently. I would wake up healthy and happy, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But every night the behavior returned. After about a week of this, my mother was desperate for answers. Whether it was a curse or simply some strange medical issue, she wanted it to stop. Someone eventually recommended that she visit a local priestess or spiritual healer. Exactly who the woman was, I don't know. The details of that part of the story have always been vague. What I do know is that my mother went to see her and explained everything that had been happening. After listening, the woman prepared some kind of remedy. My mother described it as a bag containing fresh pieces of meat or some other fleshy material. She was instructed to take the bag home, hold it over my head while reciting a specific chant, and then dispose of it immediately afterward. My mother followed the instructions exactly. She returned home and performed the ritual as she had been told. Then she carried the bag outside to throw it away. According to her, as she tossed it into the trash, the bag suddenly tore open. The contents spilled out. What shocked her was the appearance of the material inside. She insisted that when she first received it, The contents looked fresh and normal. But now, after the ritual, everything inside had turned completely black. Not darkened, not slightly discolored, black. She remembered standing there staring at it, unsure what to think. The experience left her deeply unsettled. Still, she returned inside and tried to put the whole thing out of her mind. That night, for the first time in over a week, I slept normally. My eyes remained closed. The next night was the same, and the night after that. The strange behavior never returned. Whatever had been happening was suddenly over. My mother considered the matter resolved, although she never fully understood it. Then, about a week later, another twist occurred. My father came back. According to my mother, he showed up unexpectedly and begged for forgiveness. Apparently, the relationship he had left her for had fallen apart almost as quickly as it had begun. The woman he had left with had cheated on him. To make matters even worse, she had allegedly cheated on him with his own brother. The relationship collapsed in spectacular fashion, and my father suddenly found himself wanting to return home. My mother always found the timing interesting. First, the strange sleeping episodes ended. Then my father came running back. Whether the two events were connected or simply coincidence was something she never claimed to know. Over the years, she told the story many times, always with the same details. The woman who claimed to place a curse. The nights spent watching her infant son sleep with his eyes wide open. The mysterious ritual. The blackened contents of the bag. And my father's dramatic return after his new relationship imploded. As for me, I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation for everything. Maybe there wasn't. All I know is that it's one of the strangest stories my mother has ever told me, and after hearing it so many times growing up, it's impossible not to wonder. My mother told me this story, and the reason it has always stayed with me is because of who she is. My mother is a very strong Christian and has never been someone who believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. She has always believed there is a logical explanation for things, and she never went looking for strange experiences or scary stories. But this is one story she cannot explain. She was there. She witnessed what happened. And even though she still struggles to understand it, she believes it happened exactly the way she remembers. The story begins with my mother's grandmother, Florence. As Florence got older, she developed severe dementia. It wasn't just normal forgetfulness. Her condition became so advanced that she often struggled to understand what was real and what wasn't. She would forget conversations, repeat things, and sometimes become confused about people and situations around her. One of the strangest things she did involved her dog, Fluffy. Fluffy had been her companion for years. Florence loved that dog more than anything, and when Fluffy eventually passed away, it hit her extremely hard. Because of her dementia, she didn't fully understand that her dog was gone. After Fluffy died, Florence had the dog cremated and kept the ashes in an urn. She placed the urn carefully on the mantel in her home, almost like Fluffy was still there with her. Whenever my mother visited her grandmother, Florence would sometimes act like the dog was still alive. She would point toward the urn and ask my mother to say hello to Fluffy. My mother would have to walk over, touch the urn, and say, "Hi, Fluffy," because that was what Florence wanted. Looking back, it was clear that Florence's mind was struggling. Her family understood that her dementia was causing her to live in a different version of reality. It was heartbreaking to watch someone they loved become lost inside their own memories. But nobody expected anything unusual to happen. That changed after Florence's daughter, my mother's Aunt Lucy, suddenly passed away. Lucy died unexpectedly, and the entire family was devastated. Because Florence was already in such a fragile mental state, her children made a difficult decision. They decided not to tell her about Lucy's death immediately. They were afraid that the news would completely break her. They worried she wouldn't understand, or that the grief would be too much for her mind to handle. So they kept it from her temporarily. They took care of everything themselves. They arranged the funeral. They made all the necessary preparations. They even bought a new dress for Lucy to be buried in. The family decided on an open casket funeral, something that was common and accepted in their family. But there was one important detail. Lucy had always disliked open caskets. She had mentioned before that she didn't like the idea of people looking at her after she was gone. She had even said that if anything happened to her, she didn't want an open casket. Her family knew this, but when the time came, they chose to have one anyway. Maybe they thought it was the right thing to do. Maybe they didn't believe it mattered anymore. After all, Lucy was gone. The funeral happened, and afterward, everyone returned to their normal lives as much as they could. The next day, the family finally decided it was time to tell Florence. They gathered around her, prepared to explain carefully that Lucy had passed away. But before they could say anything, Florence looked at them and asked for help. She seemed worried, confused, almost upset. She told them that Lucy had visited her the day before. At first, nobody understood what she meant. They assumed it was her dementia again. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she had dreamed it. Maybe she was mixing memories together. But then Florence continued. She said Lucy had come to see her, and she was upset about something. Florence explained that Lucy kept saying, "They're looking at me. I don't like them looking at me. I told you I didn't want them looking at me." The room went silent. Nobody knew how to respond. Everyone in that room knew something Florence shouldn't have known. They had not told her about Lucy dying. They had not told her about the funeral. They had not told her about the open casket. Yet she was describing Lucy being upset about exactly that. The family tried to rationalize it. They tried to convince themselves there was another explanation. Maybe Florence somehow overheard something. Maybe someone had accidentally mentioned it. Maybe she was confused and the words just happened to match. They were trying to find any possible reason. Then they told her. They explained that Lucy had died. Florence looked shocked. She immediately rejected the idea. Dead? No, she can't be dead. She looked at them like they were saying something impossible. Then she said something that made everyone uncomfortable. She was just here. Nobody spoke. They asked her what Lucy was wearing. Florence answered without hesitation. She described a dress, the exact dress Lucy had been buried in. She described the color, the style, the details, everything. A dress she had never seen. A dress nobody had shown her. A dress she had no way of knowing about. The family was completely shaken. They knew Florence had dementia. They knew her memory was unreliable. But this was different. The details were too specific. The timing was too perfect. And the words Lucy supposedly said matched something only the family knew. The strangest part was that Florence wasn't acting scared. She wasn't trying to tell a ghost story. She wasn't looking for attention. To her, Lucy had simply visited. It was a normal conversation. The only strange thing was that everyone else knew Lucy was already gone. My mother always says this is the part that bothers her the most, because if anyone else told her a story like this, she probably wouldn't believe it. She would assume there was some misunderstanding. She would look for a logical explanation, but she saw the reaction of the family. She saw the confusion on their faces, and she knew Florence had no information about the funeral. At the time, Florence was not in a condition where she could have figured everything out. She wasn't someone who could easily pretend or create a complicated story. Her mind was already somewhere else most of the time. Yet somehow she described something impossible. Even now, my mother doesn't claim to know exactly what happened. She doesn't say it was definitely a ghost. She doesn't say it was definitely something supernatural. She simply says she witnessed something she cannot explain. Maybe there is a reason for it. Maybe there is some detail the family missed. Maybe Florence somehow picked up on something without anyone realizing. The human mind is complicated, especially with dementia. There are things about memory and perception that we still don't fully understand. But there is also the possibility that something happened that night that we cannot easily explain. Maybe Lucy really did come to say goodbye. Maybe she was upset because she felt her final wishes had been ignored. Or maybe there is another explanation that nobody has discovered. Whatever the truth is, my mother has never forgotten that story. She says the fact that Florence had dementia actually makes it stranger. If Florence had been completely healthy, people might argue she had somehow found out. But because she was confused and disconnected from reality most of the time, it made the whole thing even harder to understand. The story stayed with my mother because she knew her grandmother. She knew what Florence was like. She knew how confused she could become. And she also knew when Florence was simply being herself. That day, Florence wasn't acting confused. She wasn't rambling. She wasn't mixing things up. She was describing a visit from her daughter, a visit that nobody else believed could have happened. To this day, my mother still tells this story carefully. She doesn't exaggerate it. She doesn't add details to make it scarier. She simply says what happened. Her grandmother had dementia. Her aunt had died. And somehow, before anyone told her, Florence knew. And that is the part nobody in the family has ever been able to explain. This is a story my dad told me years ago, and even today, he struggles to tell it without getting chills. My father has never been the type of person to invent ghost stories or exaggerate things for attention. He's always been practical, level-headed, and skeptical of anything paranormal. That's one of the reasons this story has always stuck with me. Whatever happened that night genuinely frightened him, and I've never seen fear in his eyes quite like I did when he first told me about it. The story took place about 6 months before he shared it with me. My parents had been invited to spend a few days at a friend's beach house. It was supposed to be a relaxing vacation, a chance to get away from work, enjoy the ocean, and spend some quiet time together. The beach house itself was beautiful. It sat in a peaceful area with only a handful of neighboring properties nearby. During the day, the place felt welcoming and comfortable. The sound of waves rolling onto the shore could be heard from almost every room, and the salty ocean breeze drifted through the windows. Before my parents arrived, their friends had mentioned something unusual about the house next door. Apparently, the property had developed a strange reputation among locals. Over the previous 3 years, it had changed owners 5 different times. Nobody seemed able to stay there for very long. At first, my parents didn't think much of it. People sell houses for all kinds of reasons. Maybe the maintenance costs were high. Maybe the location wasn't convenient. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Then their friends mentioned something more disturbing. The most recent owner had died only a few weeks earlier. According to what they had heard, the man had taken his own life inside the house. Nobody knew exactly why. He had seemed normal enough from the outside. There were rumors about financial problems, relationship troubles, and depression, but nobody knew the truth. The details remained a mystery. The conversation left my parents feeling slightly uncomfortable, but they quickly moved on. It wasn't something they wanted to think about while trying to enjoy a vacation. The first day passed without incident. They spent the afternoon walking along the beach, enjoying the weather and catching up with friends. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt strange. As evening arrived, the air became cooler and the beach grew quiet. Most of the neighboring houses turned off their lights one by one until the entire area settled into darkness. By the time my parents returned to the beach house for the night, they were tired and ready for bed. Everything seemed completely normal, at least at first. While getting ready to sleep, my dad suddenly noticed a faint smell in the house. At first, he couldn't identify it. He thought maybe it was something from outside or perhaps something left over from dinner. But as the minutes passed, the smell became stronger. It was gas. Immediately concerned, he began checking around the house. After a few minutes, he discovered that the pilot light had gone out. It wasn't an emergency yet, but it was definitely something that needed to be handled right away. Not wanting to take any chances, he decided to go outside and shut off the gas supply. My mom stayed inside brushing her teeth and getting ready for bed, while my dad grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the darkness. The moment he stepped outside, something felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. The night was calm. There was no storm. No unusual noises, no obvious reason to feel afraid. Yet a strange sense of unease settled over him almost immediately. As he walked around the side of the house searching for the shut-off valve, he felt a chill run through his body. The temperature hadn't changed, but suddenly he felt cold. Very cold. He later described it as the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you, even though you can't see anyone nearby. The darkness seemed heavier somehow. Every shadow looked deeper than it should have. The sound of the ocean, which had felt peaceful earlier in the day, now seemed distant and unsettling. He tried to ignore the feeling and focus on finding the gas shutoff. Still, the nervousness continued to grow. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. His hands felt tense. He found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder. The entire area was silent. No cars, no people, no movement, just darkness. Eventually, he located the shutoff valve and crouched down to turn it. As he reached for it, a voice suddenly spoke, clear, close, and unmistakably real. "What are you doing?" My dad said the words sounded as if they had been spoken by someone standing only a few feet away from him. Not distant, not muffled, not imagined. The voice was calm and direct, almost conversational. Without thinking, he immediately answered, shutting off the gas. The response came naturally, the same way anyone might answer a simple question. For a split second, the exchange felt completely normal. Then reality hit him. He froze. Every muscle in his body locked up. His mind raced as he realized something terrifying. Who exactly had asked him that question? Slowly, he turned around. There was nobody there. The yard was empty. The neighboring property was dark. No figures stood nearby. No one was walking around. No doors were open. Nothing moved. For several seconds, he simply stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had happened. His heart pounded in his chest. Maybe it was my mom. That was his first thought. Perhaps she had stepped outside without him noticing. Perhaps she had called out from a window. Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But even as he considered those possibilities, he already knew something didn't add up. The voice hadn't sounded distant. It hadn't sounded like someone speaking through a window. It had sounded like a person standing right beside him. Suddenly overwhelmed with fear, he abandoned any attempt to investigate further. He hurried back toward the house as fast as he could. By the time he reached the door, his hands were shaking. He rushed inside and immediately looked for my mom. She was exactly where she had been before, standing in the bathroom, brushing her teeth. She looked up, confused by the expression on his face. My dad asked if she had come outside. She said no. He asked if she had called his name. Again, she said no. She hadn't left the bathroom. She hadn't spoken to him. She hadn't heard anything unusual. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The voice hadn't come from her. Whatever he had heard outside had come from somewhere else, or someone else. He tried to calm himself down and convince himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the wind had carried a sound from somewhere else. But deep down he knew none of those explanations felt right. The voice had been too clear, too close, too real. Neither of my parents slept much that night. Every small sound seemed louder than normal. Every creak of the house made them jump. The atmosphere inside the beach house felt completely different after what had happened. The comfortable vacation home they had enjoyed earlier now felt unsettling and oppressive. My dad couldn't stop replaying the experience in his head. Again and again he heard those words, "What are you doing?" And again he remembered answering before realizing there was nobody there. As the hours passed, his anxiety only grew stronger. Finally, around 3 o'clock in the morning, my parents made a decision. They were leaving. Vacation or not, neither of them wanted to spend another minute in that house. They packed their things, got into the car, and drove home in the middle of the night. Neither of them looked back. The next day, they contacted the friends who owned the beach house and told them everything that had happened. When they described the voice, their friends didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss it. Instead, they looked genuinely disturbed. My dad said their faces changed immediately. The color seemed to drain from them. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of them quietly revealed something they had never mentioned before. The man who had died in the neighboring house hadn't simply taken his own life. He had done it using gas, the same gas my father had been shutting off when he heard the voice. The room fell silent. No one knew what to say. Maybe it was an incredible coincidence. Maybe there was some logical explanation nobody had considered. Maybe my father had subconsciously connected the smell of gas with the tragic story he had heard earlier, causing his imagination to play tricks on him. That's certainly possible. But my dad never believed that was the whole explanation. What bothered him wasn't just hearing a voice. It was the timing, the exact question, and the overwhelming feeling of dread that had appeared before the voice ever spoke. To this day, whenever someone asks him about the experience, he still gets goosebumps. His expression changes. His voice becomes quieter. For a few moments, it's as though he's standing in that dark yard all over again. I've heard many people tell scary stories over the years. Most of them sound rehearsed or exaggerated. Most storytellers seem to enjoy the attention that comes with a good ghost story. My father is different. He doesn't enjoy telling this story. He never brings it up unless someone asks. And every time he does, the fear still seems real. Could there be a perfectly rational explanation? Absolutely. Maybe exhaustion, stress, and suggestion combined to create an experience that felt supernatural. Maybe the human mind is capable of producing things that seem impossible under the right circumstances. Or maybe something else happened that night, something that can't be easily explained. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've never seen my father genuinely terrified of anything else in his life. Yet even now, years later, when he talks about standing outside that beach house and hearing a voice ask, "What are you doing?" From the darkness beside him, the memory still sends a chill through him. And seeing that reaction has always been the part of the story that scares me the most. This is a story from one of the first comments I ever made on Reddit. Even now, I still think about it because it was one of the creepiest and most disturbing things my family ever experienced. When I was around 15 or 16 years old, something happened with my younger sister that none of us could explain. At the time, my sister was only 3 or 4 years old. She was still very young, the kind of age where children copy everything they see adults doing. They don't always understand what something is used for. They just see someone they trust doing something and try to imitate it. One day she went into the bathroom and found a bottle of green nail polish remover near the sink. The liquid inside was bright green, and from her perspective, it looked a lot like something you could drink. We assumed she thought it was similar to mouthwash because she had probably seen our parents using things in the bathroom before. Unfortunately, she drank some of it. The moment we realized what happened, everyone panicked. We didn't know how much she had swallowed, and we had no idea how serious it was going to be. Someone immediately contacted the local pharmacy, and an assistant from the neighborhood pharmacy rushed over with ipecac and something else that was supposed to help. I think it may have been Malox, but I honestly don't remember the exact details. While we waited, my little sister was sitting on the bathroom floor. She was clearly in pain and uncomfortable. Everyone was focused on keeping her calm and making sure she was okay. But then, while we were waiting for help, she suddenly started talking. At first, we thought she was just scared or confused because of what had happened. Then she said something that made everyone freeze. She looked at us and said, "I drank some green stuff and died one time." Nobody knew what to say. She was only 3 or 4 years old. A child that young saying something like that was already strange. But what made it worse was that she didn't stop there. She continued, "My husband ran off with a girl and I got sad and drank some green stuff and died." The room went completely quiet. We were all just staring at her. It wasn't like she was laughing or making up a random story. She wasn't trying to scare anyone. She wasn't acting like she was playing pretend. She sounded completely serious. Then she said, "My girls were crying and sad when I died." That was the moment everyone became genuinely freaked out. Here we were, sitting in the bathroom, trying to help our little sister after she accidentally drank green nail polish remover. And somehow she was describing another time when she had supposedly done the exact same thing, except in her story it wasn't an accident. She described being older. She described having a husband. She described having children. She described being heartbroken after her husband left her. And then she described dying. Nobody in our family had ever talked to her about anything like that. She was far too young to understand things like suicide, relationships, or death in that way. So hearing those words come from a toddler was terrifying. Thankfully, my sister ended up being completely fine. After everything calmed down, there were no serious consequences from what happened. The biggest relief was knowing she was safe. But the strange thing she said stayed with all of us. For years afterward, we would talk about it. The part that bothered us most was how specific it was. She didn't just say something vague like, "I died before." She gave details. She talked about a husband. She talked about being left for another person. She talked about having daughters who were upset after she died. And she connected the whole story to the exact same green liquid she had just swallowed. Of course, there are possible explanations. Children have incredibly active imaginations. They can create stories that seem extremely realistic. They can combine things they have heard, seen, or dreamed about and turn them into something that feels completely real to them. Maybe she had seen something somewhere. Maybe she heard adults talking about something and remembered it differently. Maybe her young mind created a story because she was scared and confused. That is possible. There is also the fact that she was in pain and frightened at the time. Strong emotions can affect the way people talk and think, even children. But what made it unsettling was the timing. She said all of this while lying on the bathroom floor after drinking the same type of substance she was describing. It felt like she was remembering something, or at least that's how it appeared. I have no way of proving that she was talking about a past life. I don't even know if I believe in things like that. I'm still someone who looks for logical explanations first, but I also can't deny that the experience was strange. There are many stories of young children saying things that sound like memories from another life. Some people believe children are sometimes able to remember things from before they were born, especially when they are very young. Other people believe there is always a normal explanation that we just haven't discovered yet. Maybe both sides are right in different ways. The human brain is incredibly complicated. Memory, imagination, dreams, and emotions can create things that are difficult to understand. But regardless of what the explanation is, that moment changed the way my family looked at my sister. She was just a normal little kid. She wasn't known for making up detailed stories. She wasn't trying to get attention. She was simply sitting there, telling us something as if it was a normal memory. That is what made it so unsettling. A toddler described a life she supposedly lived before. She described a heartbreak. She described a death. And she did it with the confidence of someone remembering something that had actually happened. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe there was another explanation that makes perfect sense. But to this day, I still remember the way everyone reacted when she said those words. We were already scared because she had swallowed something dangerous. Then she said something that scared us in a completely different way. My sister is fine. She grew up normally. And the whole thing could have been nothing more than a child's imagination. But it remains one of the strangest things my family has ever experienced. Because sometimes the most disturbing stories are not the ones that happen in haunted houses or dark places. Sometimes they happen in ordinary moments with ordinary people, when someone says something you never expected to hear. And sometimes those moments stay with you forever.